And all our work is about the relationship between people and places. And it matters to us very much that we can speak to people directly. And if we can't speak to people directly, we can't find out the sort of complex nuances of how we live in different spaces and places, how we experience our daily life. And this is a problem, and I think it's a problem of many issues. It's a problem in terms of research methodology, but it's also very much a problem, I think, in terms of, it's a political problem about whether or not we can, oops, can you all see my slides now? Yeah, it's a problem really about whether we can hear people, whether we can actually take part in a dialogue with some of the people who are less frequently heard, who are less frequently allowed to sort of have a voice in shaping places and shaping everyday life. So this photo here is from a project we did in Birmingham, and this was probably taken just before the lockdown in the UK. And it's a street interview with a resident. We were talking to people about quality of life, about what makes them feel good in their places. And as we began to sort of move through the pandemic, this issue of voice and of accessibility and of being able to listen to people became more and more pressing as we began to see how unequal the implications of the pandemic were in terms of people's well-being, in terms of their access to work, in terms of poverty, in terms of food scarcity, in terms of all the issues we know about, and how the health impacts and the social impacts were affecting slightly different groups. So COVID threatened to disempower everyday voices, and we needed to find new ways to make them heard. This was very important to us. We've experimented with different methods. We've used photography, we've used phone calls, we've done our best with online methods. We've developed a way of doing socially distanced street interviews. But we really want to hear and we want to know from other people about what has worked in different ways, in different contexts. And I think the value of this is not only knowing about what has worked in this particular extraordinary time, but what will work in the future, what we'll take from this time and take forward and think about in our future research and our future projects. So our webinar is very much about sharing lessons about how we've all been managing our research. And we're really looking forward to hearing from all our speakers, who are fantastic, who I'll introduce in a minute. So, a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this, and we will be sharing the recording on our webinar in the future. We have a poll, which we would like you to fill out at some point. And this is really, we know that we've got a very international audience for this, and we'd really like to know where you're all from and what sector you're in. It would be really interesting, so do fill this out at some point. After our presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, and the Q&A session will be, so in order to submit a question, you need to, if you can see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, please try and use that. If you can't see the Q&A box because of the way your Zoom is set up, then do use the chat box. So what we'll do is we'll be looking at the questions as they come in and sort of responding to them as we come back. And when you, after the presentations, and when you do questions, could you say who it's aimed at? So who the question is for. If it's for all the panelists, that's fine, but please direct it. And also who you are and where you're from, just so we know a bit about where people are coming from, literally. So that's where we are with this. So I think we'll start now. Is there anything I've missed, colleagues? Is that fine? So our first speaker, we're kicking off with the speaker from the UK. Our first speaker is Dr. Chris Foy. Chris is a Knowledge Exchange Associate at CAISH, the Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. And he's currently working on developing links between academics, practitioners and policymakers. And his experience weaves through a range of disciplines, including sociology, economics, psychology and philosophy. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Nicola. I'm just going to try and share my slides. Great. Hopefully you can all see that. So thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about our our research project on the housing policy response to COVID-19. I'm going to briefly run through the project because I'm going to be speaking about one subcomponent of that project in particular. But I'm going to talk about the project, and then I'm going to raise two issues in particular, which this has brought up for us from a research perspective, or at least for me. I should say at the start that I suppose we might be quite different to other speakers in the room, and that this particular project, at least this strand of the project I'm working on, is actually interviewing policymakers, and is probably to a less extent place-based than a lot of the other people. But I think we've still got, hopefully there's still some lessons and themes in common that cause people to reflect on their own experiences. So yeah, as Nicola said in March, of course, that was when COVID first struck. It gradually became clear that it was going to be a critical juncture in how policy developed in a whole load of spheres, and housing is no less. It was no exception. So, in part in response to that, we, as a centre, and I should say this is a centre where we're a consortium of 14 different institutions, and we cut across policy practice and academia, and we're basically funded by the research councils and also by the Justice Foundation to produce evidence and to synthesize evidence that informs policy at a national, regional, local level. So very much in that spirit, when this pandemic hit, we thought, well, this is going to be a moment of potentially profound change. So we should really seek to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and who's driving it, and who's influencing really the change. So we therefore set up a major program of research, which cuts across, which has 6 essential themes, which you can see there in front of you: domestic abuse, housing and economy, homelessness, resilience, placemaking, and the one which I'm going to talk about today is the rented sector, in particular the private rented sector. And within that private rented sector theme, there are 2 strands. One of the strands is on activism, which is led by my colleague Adriana, who's actually on the call today. So maybe she'll be able to say something later. But the one I'm going to focus on, which I've been most heavily involved in, is the policymaking strand, and that's looking at the policymaking process as it's conventionally understood. And we looked at those across England and Scotland, and basically our research questions were, as much as what I mentioned, what were the key drivers of policy making, and who was influencing policy, and how were they influencing policy. Like most of the research, most of this research project as a whole, this has a longitudinal component, and that we're conducting 15 interviews. We've just finished conducting 15 interviews, which in the autumn, and we're going to be conducting, which we're now ready now, and then we're going to be conducting another 15 interviews in the spring. And those interviews took place via Zoom, and they also cut across England and Scotland, which were kind of 2 comparator studies, which they've got quite different political systems, and also quite different systems in terms of regulation of private rental sector. So they were an interesting case studies. Okay, what I want to talk about today, within that, given that sort of in that narrow scope, are basically what policy making in times of crises and researching policy making in times of crises. And I suppose we have 2 perspectives on this. We first of all have our own perspective of researching the policy making process as researchers, but then we also, with this particular strand of the project, we also have another perspective, which is kind of a meta perspective, if you like, is researching the researchers. And that quite a lot of interviews we were conducting were of people who were, be it think tanks, be it campaigning charities, be it local government organizations, be it central government, who were actively involved in researching. So I think there's those 2 perspectives, which I'm probably going to fuse a bit, but it's worth bearing in mind. And what I want to talk about is policy making during times of crises. And I suppose the first thing we need to do is we need to define crises. What would be a crisis? I think most of us would agree that the coronavirus is a crisis, but what exactly does that entail? And I think for us, there's three components of crises, and together they are instructive of the kinds of challenges that researchers face when trying to understand policy and policy responses. So that's how I'm going to structure it. The first two characteristics are threat and urgency. So crises are perceived as representing a major threat to things we value, be they jobs, our health, or our homes, which coronavirus was of course cover all three of those, as well as many more. The second then characteristic of crises is that they're perceived as requiring an urgent response. And typically that response is expected from central government, given the magnitude of the crisis. So together, these kind of two characteristics lead to policy developing extremely fast, quite haphazardly, and from the center. So those are, and we saw all these three things happen. And that poses a number of problems when you're actually trying to, from our perspective, when you're trying to interview people who are involved in that policy making process and publish on it. First of all, because policy is moving so quickly, there's a pressure to publish relatively fast, because if you don't publish fast, stuff becomes out of date extremely quickly because policy is changing in quite radical ways. And with that time pressure comes a kind of number of tensions and ethical issues. And those can broadly be grouped under the idea of kind of this social scientific idea of performativity. And performativity is basically the idea that the research we conduct can actually become influential and therefore can actually shape the research we're studying, the research process itself. So for example, we're studying the policy making process, but then by publishing an interim report describing that policy making process, we can then actually influence the policy making, how that policy making process takes shape. So if we say, for example, in our interim report, which is due out in January, based on our first wave of interviews, landlords have exerted a significant influence on policy, and they've had regular meetings with ex ministers, then that has a potential to actually shape then how the policy making process develops, which then therefore will shape what we're actually supposed to be studying. So the potential influence of the research has raised a number of ethical issues. First of all, it means that it's quite difficult to actually, people are quite reluctant to speak freely sometimes because they're conscious that what they're saying has the potential to be politically controversial, given there's so much political contingency in place. Also, from a practical perspective, it's often quite difficult to understand who's influencing what and where the actual power is coming from and who's making decisions. But above and beyond that, there's an ethical issue about trying to actually get people to come forward to speak, and then to come forward to speak frankly. The other ethical issue is around, and perhaps contrastingly, is there's a risk that people actually use this research as a forum in order to try and influence policy and to try and put forward a particular message that aligns with the interests they seek to advance. So, for example, some organizations may seek to exaggerate the influence that they're having, so that therefore, when their interim report comes out, it portrays it in a positive light and perhaps be more influential than what they are. So, I think those are two things we need to be cognizant about in writing up the research and conducting the surveys. And then the second theme, the last theme, the third characteristic of crisis I want to focus on is uncertainty. So crises yield radical uncertainty, and that's why this finger in the air image came from. It's unlike it's the economists Mervyn King and John Kay contrast radical uncertainty to risk, and risk is something you can calculate. You can calculate the risk of it raining the next day, you can't calculate the chance of the government doing X and Y, or the economy behaving the way it does. So this period of kind of radical uncertainty, and then that's compounded by the fact that people don't. It's not only people don't know what's going to happen; they don't know what's happening now. In that there's usually you'd find policymakers, at least at the central level, they use data sources in order to understand what's happening. And therefore, because things are moving at a very gradual level, they can make inferences from past data sources to what's happening now. So they can say, well, if evictions are at that level a month ago, nothing much has changed. Therefore, we can assume they're roughly at that level now. Whereas with the coronavirus pandemic, of course, once a huge amount of those data sources were in flux, and therefore you have data which was previously useful is then redundant. So there's a dearth of data, of relevant data, and I think that leads to a number of things happening. One is that data becomes power, becomes more powerful than what it was, and in the absence of those kind of data, those kind of slightly higher level data sets, we've found to an extent an increasing reliance on local knowledge, because because the surveys are redundant. You have to understand you have to rely on people who are on the ground to actually tell you what's happening, whether there's an increased number of evictions happening, whether there's what's happening with illegal evictions, and therefore there's an increasing reliance on that local knowledge or abstract knowledge. But it also means that those people who are able to provide that abstract knowledge, through, for example, polling, which we find quite a widespread use of, are able to. They have quite a lot of power, and they can, because there's a kind of an absence of narrative. They can use that data to then impose a narrative on the situation. And this is these two examples here, which I'm going to conclude with, are two quite basically the landlords and shelter who are organizations representing landlords and the organizations representing, broadly thought of as representing tenants, commissioned their own polls as to how much of a problem arrears were. Arrears are where private tenants are basically behind in their rental payments. And if you look at the results, they both actually found quite similar things in terms of the numbers were broadly convergent. But because they had the polls, they were able to use those to basically frame them in the way that they wanted, because data, of course, is never neutral. It's always framed in a particular way, and each of them were able to frame it in line with their particular narrative that they wanted to advance, as you can see in these two contrasting headlines. And organizations who weren't able to afford polling or didn't have access to polling weren't able to find it difficult to capture the headlines in the same way, because they lacked that basically foothold in the form of data. So that's basically concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Chris. That was fascinating, particularly and very relevant for the rest of the presentations, particularly the issue about how research is more influential at this point, and how urgency gives data and knowledge a kind of completely different meaning. And I think it's a really interesting one to come back to after everyone's talked about their presentations and talked about the different work they've been doing, to see whether as researchers we feel that has happened, and how that's happened, and how narratives have been created. So thank you very much, that was really interesting. So I'd like to hand over to our second presenter, who is from Lima in Peru. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Deborah Delgado Pugli, and who is a professor of sociology at the, excuse my pronunciation, Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru in Lima. And so Deborah, good smile there. Deborah's led research teams on climate change, indigenous movements, human rights, natural resource management, forestry development, and gender. So she brings a huge amount of perspective and experience to this. And Deborah has advised various international institutions and organizations in these subjects. So Deborah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you for inviting me to share with you some reflections on what we are doing here in Peru. So I'm going to share my screen as well. Let's see how it works. Just a second. Yeah. can you see my screen? Sorry, thank you. So, I will talk about an ongoing research that I am doing with a small team of researchers here in the Amazon basin of Peru, in the region of Ucayali, which is the second biggest region in Peru, and has that is in the Amazon basin. And so this is work that just that the field work started in October, but we were reflecting upon how to do it and the importance of doing it and the ethics of doing it for a bit of a longer time, actually, because the idea of doing this research was thought in March, actually. So I'm going to share with you how we adapted to the new situation. So this is really an opportunity for me to share some non-structured thoughts about something that has different aspirations and objectives at the same time. So I structured the presentation in some questions. How did we start it? What motivated us? How are we working? And what are we learning? Peru was particularly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was, we have a very small state, a lack of health care, that it's a structural problem of how the Peruvian government works and the services are organized and the budget is allocated. And the Amazon basin is a region that doesn't have, particularly on health and education, has the lowest indicators of the country. So we know that is something that we have been showing and teaching for a long time. And as I was doing fieldwork before, I knew that there was an issue on racism and how we deal with public health in the Amazon basin. At the same time, indigenous peoples from the region have an extensive knowledge on the use of plants. And the traditional medicine has a memory on the use of plants for epidemics that is not new. It's actually a memory. And I was very interested in this issue, but at the same time, the context was very urgent, was very complex, and there was a lot of suffering going on. So usually I do fieldwork as an individual. I expose myself to what is happening in the place. I stay as long as I can, and I talk with a lot of people, mainly informally, and of course, in structured interviews. So that used to be my approach. And what I really valued is building trust. So the people that I worked before in past fieldworks are my friends, are my network. And this happened to be kind of the reason I started working on this, because I saw it as an opportunity to collaborate with local people that were working on the problem as it deployed, as it unfolds. And I have to say that the Ucayali region reached 80% of its population as infected of the virus. So it was, almost everybody had it, no? 80% is like, you have to know many people that suffered from it and had a very, like, some people were impacted heavily, and they were not only old or with prevalent conditions. So there was a network of allies that formed around Ucayali with the people that work there, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, demographics, you name it. Everybody that used to do field work in Ucayali became part of this network. And by WhatsApp, we started sharing what was happening with our friends in different communities, and what we could do to help them out as the peak of the pandemic was happening. And I saw a call for COVID research, and I thought, oh, this is a wonderful opportunity to give some money to my friends so we can work together. So it was actually a way of collaborating with them, like, and not really something that I had in mind for, publishing or whatever. But as it was so compelling what was happening, we started with the two people I'm working now, two wonderful women that is working with me now. We started to reading a lot about how pandemics deployed, what happened before in the Amazon basin. So we designed the project to discuss the place of the deceased, the place of the person that is contagious and the person that is sick. Because although we don't want to idealize resilience, we want to show how action is deployed. Nobody is just a patient, just as without any agency. So the first step was to contact the local Office of Development of Indigenous Peoples, because it was managed by an Indigenous person, and I thought that was, well, I'm sure it's exceptional, and how influential they were in policymaking was also very exceptional. So the conversation started in May, and it was done by WhatsApp. So many of the things that we did had digital means. And finally, we could start like a structured fieldwork in October, once we got the answer of the financial means and everything. So what we are trying to do is documenting and reflecting on how local action took place to cope with COVID-19. And the things that we're following is how action came from subnational government and indigenous networks. And the images and everything that you can see, just a few of them were out of my, like, we're working as a network now. So I'm gonna keep the structure and then I'll tell you about it. So what we're trying to do is to allocate time to find out, to synthesize some lessons learned, and trying to reflect as things unfold, and establishing some parallels with previous epidemics. And some things are emerging then. And we formed network to work. So we have, I'm collaborating with a researcher that works with the local subnational office for the development of indigenous peoples, and somebody here in Lima. And then we have a lot of friends and sources that are with whom we work and we reflect. So what we usually do is sharing what's happening, information, images, and things as it unfolds. But at the same time, we, as Jackie, my colleague in Ucayali, is there, and she has collaborated with all this action. She's now doing these structured interviews with the people she used to work with, to answer the big urgency of the pandemic in May, June, and up until September. So the big peak was very long, actually. And then now that the pandemic is dropping, and we know that almost everybody, like 80% of people were affected and are no longer contagious, actually. I traveled last week to Ucayali and spent some time with them, but it was a different way of doing fieldwork. I spent loads of time talking actually with my team, finally meeting them face to face, because I was introduced to them by people I really trusted. So we had this weird way of working where we trusted each other because we were part of a bigger network. And this is something exceptional. I wouldn't have done it in other times. And but the trust was actually built very easily. And once we met each other, the conversation was amazing. And also we, by these virtual means, we kind of find out what we wanted to do, our objectives, in a collaborative way. Like what we were seeing, it was kind of what we were seeing emerging was the thing that we were following, because the questions that we have are pretty abstract. And I think as this is an urgency, this fits very well. So we have a practical part that is doing a document for policy making, and another one that is the main one that is more reflecting on how indigenous peoples use their memory of previous epidemics to react on new ones. So questions emerge and things emerge from these two big questions that we have. And up until now, we have done 25 interviews on policy, and we are moving on to the place of traditional medicine and how plants take a role, how self-organization take a role, what is their place in cosmovision, like the action of the plant, and how we recognize several plants as actants. And this is something that that is emerging in a very interesting way. So we are kind of seeing two worlds that come and go, that find themselves and then separate themselves. How public health is dealt in Peru, and how traditional medicine works. And this is striking, like how indigenous peoples take care of themselves by caring. No, they stopped this protocol. They don't do this for their self-care. Like they build a new, like a center for responding to the pandemic, and they do massage, as in China, like to help people breathe, but also to with other objectives that are more ambitious, by massage with plants and inhaling other plants. So they learn from experiences in several communities, and they share what several clans find out on how to use the plants and create new recipes. They share the recipes by WhatsApp, by YouTube. So there's an interesting mixture of tradition and digital means to share information. So what we were doing as a fieldwork dispositive is kind of what they were doing to share their experiences. So it fit very naturally, because those are the means that we have now to cope with what is happening. But as I was there, and as we were talking, and also about WhatsApp, one of the things that we don't want to do is to frame resilience as something heroic and as they can be self-sufficient, because it is not the case. It is absolutely remarkable, and praise has to be made to how solidarity deployed. But what is happening is an active abandonment. Citizens who are actually being actively abandoned, and protocols that are not made for caring, but actually to reduce responsibility from public administration. And this is something that we can't say and highlight and, you know, argue more strongly. We want to show how they have means to answer to epidemics and memory to use, but this is because there's no other thing to do and no dialogue with the public health services usually. At the same time, we're finding that there's new lessons learned from this epidemic and some changes at the subnational level that are to be praised, that are constructive. So what has to do with methodology, the importance of deep listening was very, very, very clear, because when we talk about policy, emotions, how we deal with suffering, how we deal with care, how we deal with memory, how are we going to deal with the implications for our sensibility, all the health secuelas, I don't remember the name in English, but the consequences that will come, will emerge, and they are actually there now. So deep listening became something very important because issues superpose. So it was actually better to let the discourse unfold. Then the importance of trust, and trust can be made by several means. It's not only about seeing each other face to face, but face to face, of course, has it's irreplaceable, but other means can also help us to build this. And the value of reflecting together about what is happening, what we know and what we don't, because there's so many unknowns, and this is something very particular of COVID-19. Nobody actually knows, but we discover many things and we are all trying to learn. So talking with shamans and people that use traditional medicine, we find out how science and scientific methods are not the only ones to create knowledge, no? So I think that's it for me, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was so interesting. I have so many questions. And I thought it was really interesting, something you said quite early on about the fact that this, your way of working gave Indigenous peoples a kind of a role that they wouldn't have had in other times. I just thought that was really fascinating about how working in a crisis and urgency sort of opened up opportunities as well as causing huge amounts of suffering. And I am, you know, the idea of a community where 80% of people had COVID is extraordinary to us, I think, from London. But thank you so much. That's really, really interesting. So our next speaker now is Lisa Marie Gikel. Lisa, are you there?
Yep. Sorry, I'm here. My internet's a little bit patchy, but I'm still here.
That's fine. And just to say, you forewarned us, just for everyone else, that if your internet goes down, you may switch to sound only and abandon.
Yes.
If that happens, that's just to be prepared, everyone. So Lisa Marie is part of the research team at Local Trust, and she's going to talk about the Local Trust research into community responses to COVID-19. And the Local Trust, for those who don't know about it, is its main aim is to work directly with residents to make lasting change in local communities. So Lisa, over to you.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen now, hopefully it will work. Okay, lovely. Thank you. So yes, I'm Lisa Marie and I work as a researcher at Local Trust, and I'll be talking a little bit about the impact that COVID-19 had on our general sort of research and evaluation programme within Local Trust itself, along with sharing some learning and reflections on behalf of researchers that we're working with on our major research project exploring community responses to COVID in 26 communities. So before I start, just a little bit of background about who we are and what we do at Local Trust. So as Nicola mentioned, we are a place-based funder and we support 150 neighbourhoods or big local areas in England. Local Trust was established in 2012 to manage a big local programme, and this is a National Lottery community funded programme which committed over £1 million plus to 150 separate neighbourhoods across England, and 10 to 15 years in which they had to spend it. In general, we believe in putting power, resources and decision making into the hands of local communities to enable them to transform the places in which they live. And some key principles about the big local programme are that it's long term, so it provides a certain amount of certainty and continuity over 10 to 15 years. Importantly, it's resident led, so we work directly with people living, working, studying, playing in the areas rather than through organisations. It's non-prescriptive, so we enable residents to spend their funding on their own terms, in their own time, and on the projects that they judge to be most important to them. And we also accompany the programme with flexible and responsive support to those communities. But in addition to managing the big local programme, we also manage another one, which is called the Creative Civic Change Programme, that works with 15 communities across England to use creativity to make meaningful change in their local areas. So what do we do in the research and learning team at Local Trust? Well, broadly, we support the organisation's vision by providing research that demonstrates the value of community power and control of resources. And our mission is to undertake research and evaluation on the organisation's management of the big local programme and the support that we offer as part of that. But we also support the big local programme by providing research and evaluation support directly to the communities involved in the programme. In relation to the research and evaluation support that we provide to those communities, we do this through measuring change support, which includes training sessions to help them develop their skills and confidence to measure the changes that they're making in their communities. And we're also interested in supporting, like how best to support community-led evaluation too. So we also work with a number of the communities on evaluation projects where they get to decide what they want to measure and how. We also undertake and commission research and evaluation on the management of the big local programme itself and the support that we offer as part of that. And we do this in lots of different ways. This can include surveying residents and community members involved in the programme to see how it's working for them. And we also evaluate the people and organisations that we commission to provide specific support to them to see how that's working and how that might need to be changed. In addition to all of this, we also conduct research on particular topics that are of interest to us, such as community leadership, community assets and power. And an increasingly important aspect of our work is helping to build our evidence base in relation to transferring power and decision-making to communities, which we then use as part of our influencing work to inform policy and practice. Now, as expected, the pandemic had quite an impact on what we were able to do and how we were able to do it. But I think in hindsight, the impact wasn't as substantial as perhaps it could have been. So first of all, we had to cancel some face-to-face field work and any existing sort of research and evaluation work that would have been taking place in the communities. And this included group workshops, face-to-face interviews and things like that. We also paused some projects. For example, the support that we offered to communities to help them to evaluate their projects and activities, that had to be paused temporarily as the activities and projects that they wanted us to help them to evaluate stopped during COVID. But we actually also adapted quite a lot of our projects so that we were able to continue. And I think this is probably how we managed to continue much of what we had set out to during the pandemic or during this year. So for example, we delivered evaluation training courses online instead of face-to-face. We also offered new training to our communities on remote and online research methods and tools to help them to carry on doing what they wanted to do, but within the new context in which they were now operating. We also moved a lot of our field work online or remotely, so face-to-face interviews and workshops moved over to Zoom, for example, or Teams or the telephone. And we did most of our online surveys online as opposed to on paper. Some of the timelines for our projects also changed and had to be pushed back, such as our survey of residents across the 150 neighbourhoods. This is a biannual survey, so that was every 2 years, but we still managed to do that and get over 1,000 responses. We also changed the design of projects that we had planned and which were in the pipeline. For example, we wanted to start an ethnographic project earlier in the year, so instead we scoped how this might be done or could be done remotely, and then commissioned research based on that new approach. But we also started a new research project about the pandemic in April, and that sort of kicked off quite soon after the first lockdown. And we commissioned this research really to understand how communities reacted to, coped with and recovered from a major crisis, and to learn what sort of help communities are best placed to give, how they might make it happen, and the sort of support that they might need after the crisis. And it was also a bit of an opportunity for us to research what was unfolding as it was happening, as opposed to after the event. But the general research question, the overall question that we were trying to answer and that we're trying to answer with this research is, how do communities react to, cope with and recover from major crises? In terms of how we commissioned this research, first of all, we didn't think it would be possible for us to introduce new researchers into communities to start a new project. And so we selected 26 communities where there was already a trusted relationship between community members, researchers, and established programs. And so most of the study areas are places where residents have either been supported for years through the big local program and or received funding and support through the Creative Civic Change program. We're also working with a few areas who haven't been supported by either of these programs, but again, they are areas where there are already existing relationships with researchers. I think we hoped that working in areas where there are already relationships would do a number of things or help us to do a number of things. So firstly, it would hopefully avoid placing additional burdens and stress on the communities involved during a pandemic. Would hopefully reduce the amount of time that is usually spent and needed at the start of projects to build those relationships and connections. And also we hope that it would help us to share our learning from those communities quite quickly. The timeline for the research is about 12 months. So it started back in April, it's due to conclude in March next year. There are two broad phases to the research. So the response phase from April to September this year, and perhaps a rather optimistically named recovery phase from October to March next year. In terms of the research methods, there are three main elements. There's a real-time literature review, and that produces monthly rapid research outputs or briefings, and they combine literature reviews with the learning directly from those study areas. There's field work in the study areas as expected, but this is not face-to-face. It's all taking place online or remotely through learning conversations and online observations, and these learning conversations can be individuals or groups. We're also collating films and photos from those communities to capture their responses, and that forms part of a film and visual archive. Again, there is no direct filming or photography in those areas themselves. And finally, includes some additional interviews with stakeholders who aren't involved with those 26 study areas to help bring in wider perspectives and experiences. There are a group of researchers working on the project with us, so it's actually one of the largest research projects that we've commissioned. The research is led by the Third Sector Research Centre, TSRC, and they're coordinating the group of 15 researchers working on the project for us. All of the researchers involved are researchers who we were already working with, or who were already working with and supporting the communities involved. And they're also researchers who we trusted, who are confident in the quality and integrity of their work and in their relationships with their communities. Before I go on to sharing some of the reflections on what it's been like to research during the pandemic, mention some of the main findings from the research so far. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I've included some links at the end of the presentation with links to the reports and outputs. But in general, some of the main findings from the first phase are that community responses to the immediate crisis have varied significantly, despite ostensibly facing the same crisis and at the same time. As the lockdown restrictions ease, most communities have moved on from their initial crisis response and to some extent are looking ahead. However, this is a bit uneven and the ways in which they're able to move on varies across those communities. And the role and significance of rich and established community-led infrastructure seems to underpin an effective community response. And so where this community-led infrastructure exists, and by that we mean connected networks of residents, community leadership, trust, relationships, etc., it appears to make a difference to how they're able to respond. So some reflections now from the researchers as part of the project. I think it's probably, I probably need to flag that I'm not one of those. So I'm not one of the researchers working directly on the project. And it's a bit of a shame that they're not, one of them aren't here to sort of talk to you about it themselves. But these are some of the learnings and reflections based on the conversations that I've had with them, and that's come through some of the meetings that we've had. So firstly, having links in the area before has made a difference. So most of the researchers have been working in the study areas for at least a year before the project started. So they knew the areas and some of the people already. And where these relationships were there, but weren't perhaps as strong, it took the researchers a little bit longer to get going at the start. The first interviews for the research actually took place about a week after the contract was in place. And it's unlikely that that would have been possible had they not already had those connections and relationships and trust in place beforehand. So I think here relationships were everything, and it's a little bit difficult to see how the researchers would have got the depth and the quality of the data that they have in the time that they had without these being in place before. They've also mentioned the opportunities and gains of doing remote and online fieldwork. So for some, there was more engagement via Zoom, for example. They found it easier for people to participate. There was no traveling for them. Participants felt that they could control the setting a little bit more than in face-to-face interviews. For example, it's easier to cut people off in Zoom or on a telephone. You can turn your camera off and you can just say to people that you have to go a bit easier than if they're in front of you. But there are also some challenges and losses as well with doing the remote field work. It can rely on people having the right technology and or access to the internet and able to contribute, or in them being able to access this from elsewhere or through others. When you're not physically in the area, you can miss things that you would normally pick up if you were in a face-to-face situation. So for example, things about the community in the local area itself, what it looks like, how it feels, where things are, etc. Because you're not able to be there in person and to observe it for yourself, you can perhaps end up relying a little bit more on the perceptions of those who are. And also when you're not physically in a space, you can sometimes miss those informal interactions, connections with other people and observations that you get if you were actually there yourself. And also I think one of the key things is trying to read body language and cues on video interviews, for example, or over the phone is harder. And this is particularly so when you're wanting to kind of see how people are reacting or feeling on responding to your questions. From a perspective as a researcher in the organisation, there are also a few reflections that I wanted to share. I think overall the experience has encouraged us as researchers within the organisation to embrace new and different methods. I think this is something that was probably happening before the pandemic, but this has probably made it more immediate. So that can include embracing new methods, online creative methods, online ethnography, for example. And for us, it's also demonstrated the value of faster research outputs as well. Perhaps not every month, like in this case, but we can see that how this can be helpful depending on the project, and particularly in contexts where things change quite rapidly. And this is all learning that we hope to include in the development of our new research strategy and the projects that we're hoping to conduct in the future. And we're currently in the process of developing it, but what we've been learning so far will help us in that work. And finally, the experience has also sort of, for us, highlighted the advantages that we have as an organisation and as a research team within that organisation, in that we have been working in a number of areas for years now. And in many ways, it's because of these relationships and the trust that had been established with people in those communities that had made this possible. But not only do we have communities that we have relationships with as part of the programs that we manage, but we also have a group of researchers who are used to working with those communities. And without those, without them, I don't think this piece would have been possible either. And there are some links here to some further information about those projects, which I can share afterwards, but I think I'm probably over time now.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa Marie. That was really interesting and resonated with a lot of our experience in social life. And I think, again, there's this notion of what knowledge means and about the need to produce fast results and the need to sort of spread what you're doing quite quickly, and that sense of a greater opportunity to influence, which I think is really interesting. And again, coming back to the sort of question of trust and trust, how you trust researchers, how researchers trust communities, how communities trust researchers. So those things I think just really resonate and they're really important. Can I just remind everyone, questions please. If you wish to do that, the Q&A facility is there, and please, we've got some coming through, but it'd be great to get more, and please say like who the question is for, and who you are and where you're from. That would be fantastic. Thank you. So moving on to our next presenter. So our next presenter is from Taiwan, and can I introduce you to Anjet Chen?
Oh, hello.
Oh, hi. Hello. Okay, so hi. So Anjet is an independent artist and curator, and the co-founder of Slants Projects, which is a digital space for experimental collaborations. And Anjet was part of the curation team for the Suzhou Panorama, which was the Suzhou International Suzhou Design Week in China, and brings all that experience to her presentation now. So Anjet, over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for Social Life, this invitation, and thank you, Deborah, for your introduction. Well, it's a great honor to be here sharing my art practice, which is very different from social research to a bunch of social research experts. So I guess I will just start sharing my screen. Right, so can you all see my screen now? Yeah? Okay, cool. So as I am probably the only art project amongst all the projects presented here, I think I arranged my part to begin with what I consider social research from the position as an artist / researcher / digital content creator with an online persona. And then I will talk about what I've done so far and the constellations I put forward to bring this research project further. What I'm going to share today is less an academic research, but an art project work in progress, which by nature is often practice-based or sometimes practice-led, depending on the relationship between the artwork and the research activities involved in the process of making. As I said earlier, I should state clearly that I am not a social researcher by training. The closest background I have that I came from is architecture. But instead of the cool-headed side involving like technical drawings or site planning, I picked up the artistic, critically expressive skills. And of course, I ditched all that matters for being an architectural businessman. Having said that, the third person objectively doesn't stand between me and my work. However, it doesn't mean the work is not methodological. Today's topic is about conducting social research in the time of pandemic. Yet the disclaimer I just gave previously also suggests that I take a specific stance against the word social in terms of social research. The stance is grounded by my life, love, and recently work experiences as a queer in Taiwan that makes the widely accepted norm of the word social and oppressive. The same social also bear witness to the mass killing conducted under the conservative administration in countries like the UK, US, Brazil, etc. Meanwhile, it's being cracked open by the rise of Black Lives Matter and the emergence of online support platforms for easily isolated individuals, such as the poor, the disabled, the aged, the uneducated, or anyone that could be considered marginalized. Myself included is taking care of an online platform called Slum Projects for QT/BIPOC people in the arts and design with a queer partner. I'm not an optimistic person by nature, so I will not promote the hope of COVID making the world anew. However, the many acts of living up a new normal by researching for a new social is manifested in activities I just mentioned. Breaking social constructs through active listening, providing lived understanding in respect of others' lived experiences, fighting for the voices of the minority, and dismantling the tyranny of a collective to encourage universal empathy. Of course, the various acts are yet to be much enough to course correct the old normal. We're not doing enough. So, as to me, the subject at stake for social research is how to substantiate, maintain, and facilitate the internalization of those activities, or alike, they are sprouting out of the pandemic. I ask how a lot in my artwork. What is how important? It's not simply for practicality of doing. Following my practice in the past 2 years, I have realized asking how is to fully comprehend the act of doing and the politics at work between the doer and the being done, it reveals. How does one become? How does a policy fail? How does the neighborhood decline towards a certain condition? What constitutes to how should be trackable activities and causes describable with verbs. That could be toxic routines, lack of care, interest-driven territorial conflicts, etc. Information as such has effects, providing materials and clues to creating plausible answers. It's worth noting that answers are created, not given, because giving answers is an act of conquest. In Ursula Le Guin's famous essay, World Making, the act of making comes from the old world. To find a world, maybe you have to have lost one. In this pandemic, we are utterly lost. It's in this best condition to start making a new world, to find the seeds that will grow into something that is yet to be named. Queer Kidney and Digital Myth is an attempt to respond to this calling for myth making. It's a social research strategy implemented in the name of an art project. But why kidneys? Why not lungs, since I smoke too much? Well, like all my personal works, this project didn't happen without an unexpected event. Queer Kidney emerged from a diagnosis from a Chinese medicine practitioner. It says my kidneys are on the verge of failing. This confusing information was accompanied by a prescribed 30-minute therapy walk every day between 5 to 7 p.m. Following the prescribed therapy walk, I am gradually turning this uninvited knowledge of my body into a shareable space through the genuine care and curiosity from my Instagram followers. So I'm going to share with all of you my Instagram page. Practice-led, isn't it? So let me see how I'm going to do this to share my Instagram page. All right. So since I started my therapy walk, although I don't share Instagram story every day or every time when I have therapy walk, but I still share some. So I create a set of highlights under the Instagram where you can actually archive your stories and then show them to your audience without any limited time. So this is where I share my walk, and I type down some information about the places I walk to, about what piques my interest. And this is Junmei Park, which is the place I walk the most frequent during my therapy walk. And I noticed there are a lot of interesting information in this park that people just often overlook, such as this private storage, which is actually an urban ruin. And this storage also is a rubbish field where people just dump their rubbish. Yeah. And then I started to ask my follower what they want to know more about this area. And then I get responses from them, which encouraged me to understand this place more. All right, so this is part of my story on Instagram. So let's go back to the presentation. This one. Okay. So we have seen the pandemic creating a boom in the usage of online platforms, right? Like artists, content creators, institutions are all using it to host talk, live events, and pre-plan contents. Although digital environment has an underdeveloped ethic. As a small account, I was aware that my friends and followers in Europe will see the stories I post, and my intention was just to share my life with them. Nevertheless, the more I walk, the more I see. The more I started asking, how can I do for the body of an urban area and its constituent through opening up my kidney therapy process? Oh, okay, it's working. So I returned to my identity that has been thrown back to the closet since I returned to Taiwan in 2019. Being a queer here is not an affordable option, since the term queer is still largely rendered by celebrity culture, fashion lifestyle, nightclubs, and drag. Queer are high-paid foreigners, well-dressed creative industry professionals. So I wondered, who are the queers in this whitewashed former colony? Can the term queer be charged with social justice apart from the marketed, politically consumed issues such as gay marriage? Where are the sites for recontextualizing this word that was imported by Western educated Taiwanese back in the 90s? My kidneys are finding a world, and it is now a queer social research. The response I received from my followers on Instagram are like mythical clues that has been luring me into something I do not know yet. Then the concept of digital myth came into my mind as a strategy. Myth is known as the story of people, is preserved and endorsed by society and passed on to its generations. Is the genre considered as having a fundamental role of a society? One reads the human characters, such as weaknesses and flaws, from godlike features. In other words, as a literary genre, myth can glorify the disabled while it dehumanize the powerful. On the other hand, myth is hardly distinguished from misconception in contemporary society. Bearing those in mind, when finding a world from the old one, I consider the methodology of digital myth in this social research project threefolded. First, I utilize myth as a surgeon's knife to open up the kidney therapy I am prescribed. This led me to discover the connection between kidneys and state of emotion, as well as layered condition of the Jinmei Park. Then, the followers who responded to my stories are interpreters, making their understandings to the stories I posted and contextualize Jinmei Park in their own minds. This connection between the digital environment and the remote physical location enable the subverting quality of myth to be at play. I then set out to collect more stories in responding to my followers' responses. The old world where the old myth, or say misconception, is getting cracked open. This is a short video. I'll just play it for a little bit. So this is the video footage collected following one of my followers' response. And this also was also appear in the previous story which I show everybody on my Instagram. And this element in Jinmei Park is the subject in my research. In this old world, it's just a cluster of ruins, sacrificed for the sake of urban regeneration. Now it's a rubbish field. People dump their recyclable waste here, and an old disabled couple will sort them out in exchange for money in order to pay for their living. Okay, so I always find it difficult to identify myself as a researcher because after all, the pronoun I, which is often interchangeable with you in literary criticism, is the main subject of every project I make. This pandemic pushed me to opening up the I to bear the responsibility to accommodate the many I's there are not yet, and perhaps will never be we. Utilizing Instagram carefully and strategically led to a possibility to politicize a queer body, my body, to an extent that the I is no longer the singular subject at stake. This pronoun becomes a social site, a container, a confrontation field. I'm learning to be with the others, to speak with different voice, or to be the other. As the American feminist poet Adrienne Rich puts, even ordinary pronoun becomes a political problem. Yeah, that's it. And thank you. And I welcome all sorts of questions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anjet, for that. Thank you so much. I think it was really valuable to challenge the social researchers in amongst all of us. And thank you for doing that. And thank you for your quite beautiful discussion about your search for universal empathy. And you made me think about digital myths. I think we will all be thinking about digital myths after this time. It's been a very important time for us. So thank you very much for that. So our last speaker now is Dr. Olympia Moshtanu, who is a senior researcher at Social Life. So this is back to a slightly more traditional notion of social research, but I think a very interesting one that I've been very involved in working on. So Olympia, are you?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Olympia's expertise is in housing, the built environment, sustainable urbanism and evidence-based policy. And Olympia has over 8 years of experience working and liaising with policymakers, public health professionals and designers. So Olympia, over to you.
Great. Can you confirm that you can see my slides?
Yep, that's great.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Nicola. And thank you so much for all the speakers. I think there are such different points of view, and I really hope we can have a really interesting conversation afterwards, trying to weave everything together. So yeah, I will just start the presentation so we can have enough time for the Q&A. The talk I'm going to give is exactly about place-based social research and how we adapted it to the context of the pandemic. I'll quickly go over the challenges that we faced, some of our responses and the possibilities we found. And then I will focus my time on a case study that we had to, of a research piece that we had to deal with in the very middle of the pandemic here in the UK. And then I'll wrap up with some more general thoughts about, again, challenges and how our responses to these challenges can inform a more general approach, not only to our work, but perhaps to other organizations and researchers who deal with place-based research. So yeah, quickly, just let me tell you what we found as the major challenges. I would say the first thing that hit us was the research design, and especially we asked ourselves whether pre-pandemic research questions were still relevant when we were back in March 2020 here in London. We also we asked whether place-based ethnographic research was still possible. And then, like many of the presentations that we have just listened to, we had a number of questions about involving participants in our ongoing research projects. So we had to think very carefully about participant exclusion, self-exclusion, about how you can build rapport when you can't conduct face-to-face research any longer. We also had to reflect a lot on how you build trust if you want to conduct online research or telephone interviews. And then, of course, we had quite a few questions about the ethics of the research. So there have been quite a few researchers who have said that perhaps we shouldn't be conducting research at all during the pandemic, especially when here in the UK, we were under lockdown, the first lockdown. So yeah, and I think the issue of ethics has emerged in all the presentations that we have listened to. So issues of the responsibility towards the participants, but also issues of responsibility towards the research team. This was really important, especially because here in the UK and also, I would imagine all over the world, things have changed quite rapidly. So the approaches that worked one day perhaps didn't work the next day. So we had to keep adapting every single week. So now, in terms of the responses that we developed, we decided back in March, in the middle of the first lockdown, that we needed to adopt a flexible or open research design that would help us with the lockdown, but also thinking ahead about all the changes that were going to happen in terms of restrictions, in terms of physical distancing measures. So we wanted to anticipate, and we opted for a flexible research design. Also, we realized that people's willingness to be in the proximity of others was going to change throughout the summer, and indeed it changed, and then in the fall as well. The second major response that we had to the pandemic in the context of place-based research was to develop a mixed methods research design. And this is what I'm going to dedicate most of my time talking about. I'm going to talk about how we use the combination of in-depth telephone interviews, participant photography, and cognitive mapping, trying to replace our face-to-face interviewing. So now I'll briefly go over the case study that I mentioned. So in March 2020, we were involved in a very interesting piece of research about how people perceive the built environment's impact on their quality of life. It was a research across the UK that was funded by the Quality of Life Foundation. as we developed the research design very early in 2020, we decided to opt for face-to-face street interviews. And these were going to be conducted all over the UK in a range of settings, including areas that were going through regeneration, new housing developments, as well as established communities in rural areas, as well as in cities. When we were in the second week of the fieldwork, the COVID-19 crisis brought this research project to a halt. So we didn't know what we were supposed to be doing. It took a little bit of time to come up with those responses I just mentioned, but this is what we basically did. We decided to go for a flexible research design and to try to implement a mix of methods to try to replace the face-to-face street interviews, as well as to find ways to build a report with the research participants. And yeah, as I mentioned, another challenge throughout this project has been the fact that the restrictions kept changing. So we needed to account for the ways in which our research participants were going to answer us, because their environment around them was changing. And remember, this was a place-based research. It was all about the built environment. It was all about the quality of life. So this was really important for us to really understand how the changing restrictions were actually impacting our research design. Yeah, so we use a combination of telephone interviews, participant photography, and cognitive mapping. In terms of the research design, we also added 2 additional research questions, because we really wanted to incorporate in our design the impact of the pandemic. So we also asked, what role does the local area play in improving or diminishing residents' quality of life during this difficult period of time? And we also wanted to see how the lockdown changed the residents' perception of their local area. Was there anything that changed the way they related to their local area and also to their home? So to do that, what did we do? Well, we asked participants to send us 2 photos of spaces in their home where they were spending a lot of time during the time of the lockdown, and 2 photos of spaces in their local area that they were still using during the first lockdown. We left this pretty open. We gave a few examples just so people know that it can be basically anything that they were still using, from markets to bus stops to parks to some shops that were open. And the last thing we asked them to send us was a photo of a hand-drawn map of places, amenities, or facilities in their local area that were relevant to their life during the lockdown. So this was our brief to them, and we conducted 53 in-depth telephone interviews with participants from a really wide range of geographies, as well as socioeconomic backgrounds and age categories across the UK. We received about 200 photographs, and you're just about to see quite a few of them. And we also received 35 cognitive maps. You're also going to see a few of them. But before, let me just say very few words about cognitive mapping. So the participant photography, just like as mentioned, we asked them to send us these photographs. However, we did not incorporate those photographs in the interview. This is really important because I know that there are some experts on photo elicitation on this webinar. So I just want to make this clear. At that point in our redesigning the research approaches, we did not think that it was going to work that fast to actually do a full photo elicitation approach. So we asked for the photographs, but they didn't become part of our actual phone conversations. And same with the cognitive maps, they were not actually included in our questions for the respondents in our telephone interviews. Going back to the cognitive mapping. So usually it's just a sketch that captures places, landmarks, or routes between different locations. But the most important thing is that they don't just describe the physicality of a place, but they usually capture how people use, think and feel about an area. It's basically a snapshot of an individual's knowledge of an area. And as you're going to see in just a few seconds, it can be a very complex drawing. Sometimes it can be at scale, but many times it's just a simple sketch. And why did we use this mixed method research design? Because we really wanted to focus on places, as I said, homes and local areas, on everyday routines, pre as well as during the lockdown. We wanted to capture experiences of local change. We wanted to understand the best and worst aspects of living in the local area during the lockdown. And we also wanted to see if we can capture challenges and opportunities grounded in place, as we would have been able to capture had we done those face-to-face interviews, as well as some walking ethnography. So we wanted to see if these adapted research methodologies was going to get us these different things. Yeah, and just not to keep you too much waiting, this combination of methods indeed was successful at capturing a rich understanding of the materiality of experience, as well as an understanding of affects, of sensory worlds grounded in place, as well as memories, especially in terms of routines that the respondents had from periods before the lockdown. And we also were able to get a rich understanding of nested scales of lived experience, connecting the space of the home to the space of the building, the street, and the neighborhood. So now I'm just going to show you some of the maps and some of the photographs that we actually received. So as you can see here, as I said, this is a simple sketch. It captures some of the facilities and places that were still open during the lockdown. You can see the importance of green spaces. Again, here is basically green spaces and the home that, again, spaces that people still had access to. This is a really beautiful map, I'd say, in a rural area of the UK. You can see here the sheep, the village, and of course the hills and the clouds. So it's like, it's a very, I would say, simple sketch, but I think it captures, it starts capturing these routines that people had, and especially, as you're going to see in just a few seconds, the importance of walking for our respondents. But also some of these photographs, especially the photographs of the home environments, they capture the new routines like baking. I don't know if you still remember, but baking became a very important thing during the first lockdown, not only in the UK, but across the world from what I remember. So also, as I mentioned earlier, walking alone, walking with a family, taking the bike for a ride, this became very important daily routines for our respondents. So now slowly I'll come to a close. So integrating all these different bits of research, what did this give us? Well, the cognitive maps showed how limited the local worlds became during lockdown. We learned that daily routines stabilized the notion of home. It helped people create a space of domesticity and intimacy. The in-depth phone interviews, the photos, and cognitive maps together illustrate that local facilities not only connected residents to one another, but they also allowed the people to feel part of their neighborhood and to learn more about it. I'll just read you quickly two of these beautiful things that the respondents told us, because I think they very neatly go along with the photographs and maps that you just saw. Someone told us cooking was my me time. However, now I have less time to enjoy cooking as the kids want to get involved with it. Someone else said, it's beautiful here, really appreciate where I live. We've got to see it properly. Really enjoyed getting out and exploring it every day, finding new spots and places. I've been here 25 years and I'm still finding new places to explore. It's a really good place. You have the same faces that you get to know, but then you also get a tourist in the summer, which makes it interesting. Again, like this is combining basically new and old memories connected to this place. now I just want to show you a few photographs of the home environment. So this is one of them. This is another one with different uses of these spaces, and you can see people really trying to make the best use of all these different spaces. So again, very briefly together, these photographs of home environments and the in-depth telephone interviews gave us a very rich insight into the social as well as the emotional dimension of changes in the home during lockdown. The visual and oral accounts reflected on the pressure of working from home, while others focused on the need to adjust to being together with others in the same place day after day after day. And again, I would like to read just very briefly these two small accounts from respondents. One said, we've added a table in the parents' bedroom where my son has been doing his schoolwork. My wife set up her home office in the basement or the guest room. My daughter has been using an area in the living room next to the kitchen. So there was someone on every level of the house. Someone else said, it's been definitely difficult. Pre-COVID-19 work done while kids were at school, but now it's all shared space. Okay, I'm going to finish here and I'm just going to move into what we have learned so far in the interest of time. So this is my last slide. So we have taken all these bits of lessons and we synthesize them here, not just for ourselves, but also in the interest of establishing a dialogue with other researchers, and hopefully we can maintain these conversations in future events, because we'll have to keep on responding to the, I would say, that this changing situation that hasn't yet come to a close. So just quickly, the 6 lessons I wanted to share. The first one would be in-depth telephone interviews, cognitive maps, and participant photography are really useful techniques to capture layered accounts of lived experience in place. So I hope I showed a little bit of these layered accounts in my presentation. The second lesson, together, these 3 different methods reveal daily routines and relationships to place, making possible a rich understanding of the different aspects of the physical and social infrastructure on which people rely and value in their local areas. Also, cognitive mapping and participant photography can provide insight into experiences of place that people themselves do not usually think about. For instance, we learn a lot about how people move through their surroundings, as well as how people sometimes instinctively avoid certain spaces because they might not feel entitled to occupy them. A fourth point is that photography and cognitive mapping can facilitate research participant empowerment, as well as building empathy by allowing participants to direct researchers toward what is important or meaningful to them. In times of pandemic, a flexible and open research design is needed not only because of the lockdowns and physical distancing measures, but also because our meaning of place shifts constantly. And the last lesson that we drew from all these changes to our research design is that the flexible mixed method research design is a timely as well as an ethically responsible alternative to face-to-face interviewing in place-based research. Well, this was me. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the conversation. Nicola, you're muted.
No, I'm not now. Right, thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so we've got Olympia. Thanks, that was great. I'm going to move straight into questions because we have 25 minutes. So we have 8 questions so far. I'm going to go through these and try and group them for individual panelists. And then I know a couple of people want to ask questions verbally, so that's fine. So when you're answering, people, can you try and be concise? I know it's difficult, I know you've got so much, but you know, it's like we have a lot of questions here. There's a lot of interest in what you've said. We've had such rich presentations, it's great. So first of all, a question from Carolina New for Deborah. Could you tell us a bit more about the creation of networks and the use of individuals in networks, and how that actually worked in practice? And then the second question for you, Deborah, is about how your research has worked as a way of directing funding to people and communities you work with, and how that's worked in practice. And that is from Jonathan Hoskins. Those questions are slightly longer in the Q&A, but I think that's the nub of what people are getting to. So Deborah, could you kick off, please?
Thank you very much, Nicola. So I'll start with the second question, how to direct funding to communities. Well, what we have here, it's a context where people react quickly to respond to the context, to the challenges it had. So there was a network of volunteers working very hard to structure a response to COVID from the subnational government. And it was a team of people that had a lot of experience working with indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples themselves. So what I did is, and I have a very good friend that is a lawyer of indigenous people's causes, and she knows very well the place. She's got a home there. So I asked her what would be the better way. And she told me, well, there's these people I trust, you can work with them. And I started finding out who could be interested to actually document the experience. And that's how I directed the fund. So formally, it's a research assistant. In reality, I try to ask to her to do as less work as possible, so she can kind of compensate all the work she has been doing while the response was pretty active. But now she's so engaged that she's working a lot on the research, because it's also an important space to formalize what she has been living and reflect, which is something that is very valuable for this kind of very shocking context where you have to elaborate your experience. And that's how things are becoming now, like, and how questions are emerging. It's a time to reflect that we are providing collectively. And how networks were created, where it's the sense of urgency and then the building of trust. Like how we not only, like, we try to transmit different resources, our contacts, the money we can raise, the awareness raising, writing about it, blogs, news in the journals, everything we can give to create more cohesion on a society. Our country is pretty large, and the geography doesn't help much for movement, which is, it has its pros and cons. I believe it has more pros than cons. So our networks have to be a bit virtual, so we don't disturb so much the environment. So that's what we are trying to do. And the networks have been built over time. So I hope it's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is for Lisa Marie. It's from Jessica Gatter from London. And it's just to ask a bit more about the change in research methods, and particularly, probably I'm interested in as well, what you did online. And how you made that work, because it's something we've struggled with a bit.
For the research project?
Yeah.
I think, well, I think when we were designing the project, there was no sort of face-to-face interviews like factored in. So everything has been done either through telephone, Zoom, Teams. I think they've been like the three main tools that they've used as part of the research. And probably just to say on Zoom, as part of the local trust, what we did was we essentially just upgraded our account and just gave licenses to all the communities, 150 communities that we worked with. So they were already kind of using that by the time the research kicked off. And they've been using Zoom mainly for like one-to-one interviews with community members, group interviews, and also observing meetings and community meetings as well. And yeah, I think that's kind of, they've been like the three main ways in which they've kind of like used online. I'm not aware of any of like the other kind of methods.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, our experience is that I think the online has worked quite well, but it has its limitations. It's
yes,
really good.
Hit and miss.
Definitely. Okay. Next question is for Chris Foy. Chris, you there? This is from Jonah Rudlin, who's also in London. So 2 questions linked. So first of all, do you think there's been an improvement in how quickly policy has responded to new data and information? So has policy responded? You talked about the need for fast evidence. And has this depended on the sector, so private, non-profit, government, and whether it's local or national?
So I think it's quite difficult to answer the first question because it's difficult to compare it to anything else. I should also say it's difficult for us to make a judgment about how effective the policymaking process has been, because I guess it's only once time will tell to an extent. And I think, but I mean, when I heard these questions, I think it raises one thought in particular. I think that there's definitely something about, there's a difference between England and Scotland. So if you think of England, you're talking about a much larger population, obviously, than in Scotland. So housing has evolved matter. So you have a housing minister and a local minister in Scotland, and whereas in England, of course, the decision-making infrastructure is a lot more complex. And in Scotland, there seemed to be perhaps less reliance on polls and there seemed to be more confidence in local knowledge and less kind of battling over those narratives than there was in England. And I think there's a couple of explanations you could advance for that. I suppose the first explanation is that because Scotland, it's a smaller area, the policymakers and the people who actually ultimately making decisions, the politicians making decisions, are closer to the people on the ground, because that's just the very nature of a smaller country than in England. The second explanation would be that it's more the policymaking ecosystem in Scotland, at least in relation to the rental sector, is more consensual than it is in England, which is much more adversarial, tenants versus landlords, and therefore there's less of a need and less of an incentive in Scotland than in England to actually use data to frame data in adversarial ways and to actually try and command the headlines. So the policies made in a more discreet, behind the doors fashion, as opposed to using the media airwaves. So I'd say those two are perhaps explanations of why that difference emerged. But I would hesitate before actually making a kind of normative value-based judgment of who's done what better, because I just don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. As you say, it's very much kind of work in progress. All this is like what will happen over the next year is really interesting. We might be in a better phase to think about these things then, by which time it will be too late to change things. Okay, so for Anjet, a question from Claudia Contu, who is a curator based in London. So she's asking about how do you make the transition from the I to the you/they in the research reflect on the different experiences that each subject at stake might have? And she raises the question of whether the single point of view potentially could give a one-sided perspective, and how do you deal with that whilst doing your sort of social research?
Well, I think I will answer the question 1 first. I didn't show my last slides because I listed out some consideration that would actually address Claudia's question here, because I think social research, whether it's an expert social research or an artistic social research, also always centers on the issue, which is trust. And a lot of researchers today also mentioned about the building of trust or the network of trust. And because I just started this kidney therapy 2 months ago, and I've been thinking and try to digest what I want to create, what kind of relationship I want to create with these people or subject at stake. So in my last slides, I list down 3 considerations, which is I'm thinking to have therapy walk guided by local people, which is very similar to what Olympia mentioned, the kind of cognitive mapping almost, right? So I am trying to walk into their cognitive mapping by following them. And also to conduct interview, to talk about their experiences living in this neighborhood or being marginalized for such a long time. So I think it's, of course, it's impossible to become them or become another I, but I can, through those research or through those activities, I can somehow experience what I have experienced. But of course, it's never going to be the same. And then, which comes to the second question, that is about the potential of creating a one-sided perspective. Yes, I mean, it's very likely if I don't do such activities, but only just to follow my own therapy schedule, instead of, opening up this therapy process even more by inviting different social research methods, then it's very likely to be a one-sided story. Yeah, so I should have shown my last slides, I think. Yeah.
I think your walk with local people will be really, really interesting and really intriguing.
Yeah,
really,
exactly.
And then the final two online questions, both for Olympia. So for Olympia, so two questions. The first one is about research using digital placemaking methods with children, and particularly about a participatory design of play spaces in view of the pandemic. And the second question is about the potential to share the maps and data with other researchers to analyse, so other people can look at the material and think about what that means for their work.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with the second question. I think it's a very interesting question, but I think it raises some issues about participant consent and research ethics, because the photographs and the maps that we received were given to us for a specific purpose. So I'm not really sure we could share it with other researchers. I do think it's very interesting, and maybe we can think about this in the future, especially now that I have seen that a lot more researchers are trying to use secondary qualitative data. So I think that would be a great resource, creating an archive almost of all these maps and of all these photographs. And we all hope for COVID-19 to actually come to an end soon, but what if it's going to reappear in 2 years? Then that would be, of course, a big challenge for us again. But at the same time, if we are able to have this archive of photos and maps, we would be able to do some comparative project, and that would be a research opportunity. So framing the bad as a good opportunity. In terms of the first question, I would say it depends on the age of the children. If maybe they are, I would say, over 8 years old, maybe it would be really, or maybe even over 10, it would be really interesting to do a workshop and, have them take some photos and then discuss them. I haven't worked on a lot of children research, so I wouldn't know what works with them, but I can see some opportunity in bringing them together in a workshop and try to use some visual methodologies, or even trying to work with some toys or something that has more physicality to them than just words, and try to see how the world looks through their eyes.
Okay, that's great and interesting to see. Yeah, it would be a really interesting thing to do, to try and work with children on such a thing. And then our final question is from Adriana, I'm not quite sure, Swaita, I think, from Swaita. So Adriana, I think you have been enabled to speak.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi, hello.
Hi, I'm Adriana from University of Glasgow, research fellow at the Center for Housing Research. So, Nicola, if you allow me, I want to thanks to all the presenter, has been absolutely fabulous research. However, I would like us all, to think these methods, which we present them as being new and adapted for COVID, are in fact quite old, methods. Photography has been used since 1957. Telephone interviews are already classic. Every research method has a chapter on telephone interviews with all the pro and con. I thought from a methodological point of view that Angie work was particularly interesting. I would call it an autoethnography, digitally co-produced. I think that's really quite interesting. And here are my two questions. To Chris, I agree with Angie, meaning I'm not so optimistic that the crisis will open up a really different future. As you were mentioning, the uncertainty and the positive that an uncertainty can bring. But actually, I would like you to comment on the idea that we know from literature already that crises have not really shift the direction of policy, but rather have accelerated the policy in the same direction. And for instance, when I see in your talk about data, the need for data, it's a calculative practice of neoliberalism. So it's like it's reinforced. We need again the quantitative data in order to make a decision. And this privilege, one deep case study, a story. So if you want to comment on this, on the crisis. And Olympia, I'm really curious because you said you haven't done elicitation on the photography and the maps. So how did you analyze them? Thank you.
Sorry, Nicola, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, yeah, Chris, do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I should say Adriana was the research I mentioned, so I can stick with frankness to Adriana. I didn't be polite. So I think Adriana, in terms of the first question, I didn't mean to imply that that those three features of crises meant that should give us optimism. I think for sure crises demands state intervention, but that state intervention doesn't necessarily need to be progressive. I mean, you think of the intervention in socializing the losses of the banks in the global financial crisis was a massive state intervention, but it's not. But it wasn't by any means progressive. So nor does it necessarily will it last. I mean, the state once it reaches out may well withdraw as well in those areas where it's needed most, at least to pride communities. So I think that's I wouldn't be that optimistic either, to be honest. In terms of the second question about data, I don't think data is a particular to neoliberalism. I think it's. I mean, if you look at Keynesianism, which came before neoliberalism, it was perhaps even more relied even more on data and trying to understand the society in which it was intervening. So I'm not. I think that's. I wouldn't agree with you now, but we can pick that up. We can pick that up later. That's. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and Olympia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adriana. I do have to say, first I have to say that we are from the same town in Romania, which is really important. And thank you so much for your question. And also thank you so much for your articles on photo elicitation. They actually have, really inspired us as Social Life. And in terms of your question, so we debated how we wanted to use the photographs and the maps. And we decided that for that particular phase in our work was just better to look at the photographs and the maps alongside the answers that the respondents gave us. So we did a thematic analysis on all those interviews, and then we looked in parallel at the photos and the maps that they submitted and tried to understand how those maps and photos support or contradicted the themes that were coming out of our qualitative thematic analysis. So that's already, but now we are actually just starting another project in which we are using photo elicitation, because I do agree with you that photo elicitation is actually better at empowering the participants, and also is, I would say, better at challenging the positionality of the researcher. So yes, looking forward to the next conversation about this.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes left. So I have a question for all the panelists that I'd just like you all to reflect on. And it just struck me listening to all of you how we've been through a very intensely personal time where things have been challenging, weird, odd, difficult, you know, quite unprecedented. And we're doing work. And we're doing work about a world that we very much live in as individuals. And so it's sort of like, how do you think your experiences of working on COVID over the last, since February, have shaped what you'll do next? It's like, how has all of this filtered through into your future work? And you know, what are you personally taking from this experience with the work you've been talking about? So who would like to start on that? Okay, Chris, thank you.
I can start. It's quite simple. For our interviews, I think Zoom was really good. I don't think. I mean, I can see if you're where there's issues of trust and where there's issues of really kind of sensitive material. I can see how it wouldn't be, but or where you're dealing with large collectives. But I think for our particular strand of the research project, I think it was really useful. So I think I'd struggle to justify a trip for a long trip to conduct a face-to-face interview, with, you know, at least in a context like this again, I think.
Yeah. And what about the experience of urgency of crisis?
That experience, well, I think time will tell. I mean, there's two, because if there's two competing kind of logics, isn't there? I mean, you can kind of wait till the crisis has been over and then write a really kind of reflective, kind of rich overview of what happened, or you can try and produce something in the midst of it. And we're trying to do something more towards the latter end, but that's perhaps wildly ambitious. But I don't know, we'll see.
Okay, thank you. Who next? Deborah?
We've been reflecting a lot on how it impacted our practices, because also teaching has changed, and research and teaching, both of them have changed and changed our positionality. And I think the impact for me has to do a lot with positionality, and by doing research now, we, like, without being so conscious, our reflection is going more to a decolonial approach on many things of how we produce knowledge. And as you mentioned when we started, Nicola, the impact of COVID is different from a class perspective. So interclass relationships, and I mean it also for personal, you know, your friendships and the way you expose yourself to the world. I think this has become, at least for me, very important, because the source of my let's say interclass contact has to do with indigenous peoples. But if I go out of in my city, I would see somehow the same things, but with a different person and history. So what we all share is this confinement that has to do with class, that we have to break. I mean, it has been exacerbated by COVID, but it was present before. And finally, the importance of rethinking collective and individual behavior, because all the things we do individually, like our personal responsibility, has changed a lot. I mean, small behavior, like, for example, going to the fieldwork was something that I reflected a lot before leaving, and it doesn't have to do with me, it has to do with the things I'm not conscious I could bring, and the example I'm giving, and all the non-conscious factors that you have to make conscious. And this is an extra work that I believe can mark our work on the future, because this is a new normal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Lisa Marie, do you have anything you'd like to say quickly? Sorry, we are running out of time. Apologies, I shouldn't have asked such a big question so close.
Yeah, quite a big question.
Yeah,
I just very broadly and generally, I think it's like, for me personally as a researcher, and also as quite a new researcher, I think I'd like to sort of like class myself, but I think it's just made me be even more open and flexible in terms of like thinking about how research can be done, and particularly reflecting on, I guess, some of the previous projects that I've been involved in, and tending to focus on more like traditional research methods and done in a certain way. And I think what we've seen this year has just kind of like put everything onto the table. And so just being a little bit more like experimental and flexible in how we go about our future research.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. What's your response? Oh,
sorry, the connection. The connection. Sorry, the connection is not really stable. So I think because I have been closely observing how social media has been, overly utilized during the pandemic, and I think I would really like to spend some effort and time to dive into if social media can be such a powerful tool to be so influential among almost the entire world in terms of raising awareness. It might have the possibility to become a research tool for social researchers, but at the same time, what are the dangers of using social media? Because online environment, digital environment is still so underdeveloped in terms of ethics and like standard practice, etc. So yeah, I think through some art projects, I might try to look into this a little bit more.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Yeah, that's good. And Olympia?
Well, I would just follow up on what Adriana said earlier, and also Lisa Marie right now. I think it's all about keeping in mind that these methods are not necessarily new, right? Some of them come from the 50s, but at the same time, I do think that COVID-19 has made us a bit more courageous, and I don't know, force us to take a little bit more risks and try to force us maybe to try to combine different methods and find an arrangement that work in that particular place much better than if we had just used methods that have been tried before. So I would say I hope we are going to be more creative and take more risks in the future, even if we are not living through a COVID-19 context.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've run over 5 minutes, which is very bad practice, so apologies everyone for that, but thank you so much for our fantastic presenters. That was great. It was so varied. It was fantastic. It was really good. Really appreciated that. We will put our recording online. We will be in touch with you about blogs possibly and other collaborations in the future. And for people who attended, thank you so much. I hope that was useful. Please do stay in touch with us. Thank you. They're really great presentations. Right. Goodbye. Everyone take care.